Hi everyone, I'm Megan Benton. I'm a policy analyst at MPI. I'd like to welcome you to Unpacking the Links Between Segregation, Community Cohesion and Opportunity. I'm excited to announce that this is the first webinar that MPI is bringing to you from 4 different countries. So welcome to this rapidly globalizing community, and fingers crossed that the technology will hold out. This webinar today is concluding a Transatlantic Council series of work on cities and regions. And today we're publishing the final 2 papers in the series. The first is Residential Segregation, a Transatlantic Analysis by John Iceland, who'll be speaking later. And the second is a case study on Rotterdam entitled Rotterdam, Long-Time Port of Call and Home to Immigrants, which is by Han Ensinger and Godfried Engbersen, both at Erasmus University. As I'm sure many of you know, the Transatlantic Council is a deliberative body that meets twice a year to discuss cutting-edge immigration issues. In November of last year, we brought together a high-level group of local and national policymakers from Europe, North America, and Australia to discuss how the different levels of government can better cooperate on immigration and integration issues. And the Council discussed questions such as how regions can attract the workers they need within the confines of often slow-moving national immigration policies, and it also looked at some of the localized challenges that can result from fast-paced population change. Now, for those of you who are sitting on the edge of your seats waiting for the results of the Scottish referendum, like me, you'll know that whatever the outcome, the future of Scotland's immigration policy will be something to look out for. So even if it's a no vote, which is currently looking like the most likely option, Scotland might still push for some more devolution of immigration policy. So if you're the kind of geek who's interested in different models of place-based immigration policies and the risks and trade-offs associated with giving regions more of a say in immigration policy, I'd like to point you to this series of papers, which is currently hosted at www.migrationpolicy.org/transatlantic, and we've also published 2 papers that I mentioned earlier on that website. There's also some excellent papers on entrepreneurship and tech clusters. Anyway, end of plug. So moving on to today's discussion, it's become a bit of a cliche to say that integration is a local affair. We all know that cities do the heavy lifting when it comes to welcoming newly arrived immigrants, adapting public services to accommodate mobile communities, or promoting diversity in public events and spaces. And one of the areas where cities have perhaps found it most difficult is in their efforts to keep neighborhoods mixed and vibrant and cohesive, and ensure that their inhabitants can access the same opportunities wherever they live. This issue of residential segregation is often described as one of the most negative impacts of large-scale immigration. So some people worry that segregation can exacerbate poverty or social exclusion, but others just think straightforwardly that segregation must mean that integration has in some way failed. Of course, it's one of those issues that's quite often caricatured by sound bites and headlines, and in fact the situation might be a little bit more complex. So across Europe, obviously residential patterns vary widely, and segregation needn't always be harmful. So high immigrant neighborhoods can sometimes have benefits for their inhabitants, especially for new arrivals. They can act as a kind of stepping stone where people can draw on national networks as they find their feet, and then as they become more affluent or their children become more affluent, they can move on elsewhere. So the objective of today's event is to dig deeper into some of these issues, and we've assembled a wonderful group of people to help answer these questions. First of all, we'll have John Iceland from Penn State. He's going to discuss the paper that we're launching today, which draws on evidence on segregation from both sides of the Atlantic. Next, we'll have Corey Laus, who's going to discuss Rotterdam's efforts to create mixed neighborhoods and strengthen social cohesion in Rotterdam. And then Patrick Simon from Sciences Po will speak about the relationship between segregated neighborhoods and socioeconomic opportunities in France and beyond. Just before I turn to the first speaker, one logistical note is that you can email questions at any time, even when the speakers haven't finished, to communications@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet at #MPICities. So first up, I'd like to introduce John Iceland. John is Professor of Sociology and Demography and head of the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Penn State. And he's an expert in social demography, poverty, residential segregation, and immigration, and is the author of several books that examine these social challenges through a demographic lens. These include A Portrait of America, Poverty in America, and Where We Live Now, Immigration and Race in the United States. And John's also probably the person who's done the most to think about what the comparisons and differences are between the US and Europe in terms of housing patterns, the outcomes of these patterns, and the different policy approaches taken on both sides of the Atlantic. So welcome, John. Many thanks for joining us, and please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. First, I'd like to start by echoing some of your words in sort of introducing the importance of the problem. I think there isn't anything inherently bad or terrible about segregation in itself. I mean, people often like to live with friends and family, and they draw strength from their social networks. I think what we're mostly concerned about is when residential segregation is reinforced by discrimination and by social exclusion. So when it's really associated with kind of overlapping inequalities, when it's associated and helps produce educational disparities, income disparities, and things like that. So I think the motivation for the paper and certainly this webinar is that this is an issue of growing concern in a number of countries. We have growing immigration worldwide, certainly in Europe. We have growing diversity in Europe and the United States. And so people are concerned, well, what's going to be the end result of this? Is it going to result in new kinds of social divisions? So as part of this study, I reviewed, you know, a number of people have obviously looked at this issue. I myself have. And I'd say overall, there are a few patterns that stand out. First of all, I'd say more generally, when comparing the United States and Europe, we see that residential segregation is a little higher in the United States, in American cities than in European cities. I should mention that this extends a bit beyond just race and ethnicity, but to other social characteristics such as income and age and so on. I think American cities are a little bit more fragmented, sprawling, certainly less central planning than in European cities. So that's why you see somewhat higher levels of segregation overall. Now, when thinking about segregation of different groups in the United States, as most of the people who I'm sure have joined us today know, segregation is highest among African Americans. Black-white segregation has historically been extremely high, reinforced by discrimination and racial oppression. The good news is, at least over the last 3 or 4 decades, there has been some declines in black-white segregation. But we see a lot of variation across American cities. So it still remains very high in Rust Belt cities such as Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, where Ferguson is, but considerably lower in newer, sort of growing, more vibrant cities in the south and western part of the United States. Now, among other groups, segregation of Hispanics is a bit lower, and segregation of Asians in the United States is lower yet. And in fact, the segregation of these groups is more along the lines of what we see in terms of the segregation of immigrant groups in Europe. So, turning to the European context, again, segregation levels tend to be lower, but we see a lot of variation with some Muslim groups in particular in some cities being fairly highly segregated. So thinking of it, for example, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in a few cities in Great Britain, Turks and Moroccans in The Hague. Though we do see more modest levels of segregation for other immigrant groups. So I think the natural question is, well, what is shaping these patterns of residential segregation? And I think it's important to note that there is something about the immigration process itself that helps produce some level of segregation. So when immigrants arrive in a new country, they often settle in ethnic enclaves. After all, that's where their social networks draw them. That's where they feel most comfortable. Now, if segregation was just about the immigration process, what we would see over time and especially across generations, more residential integration. So let's say as immigrants, as their socioeconomic status rises, perhaps as they learn about the amenities in a broader range of neighborhoods, we might expect that them and especially their children might move to a variety of neighborhoods. Now, of course, the counter-argument is if there's discrimination or social exclusion or avoidance of these immigrant groups. I say by and large, if there's a sort of overall pattern, we do tend to see that higher socioeconomic status immigrants tend to be less segregated than lower socioeconomic status ones. If anything, the children of immigrants do tend to live in more integrated neighborhoods than their immigrant parents. So I think by and large we are seeing some level of residential incorporation. But again, I think it's important to note that there's a lot of variation across groups and cities, so that locally I think it still remains quite a problem in many places. Just the last part, you know, in the paper itself, I talk a little bit about policy options, and I just want to mention a couple of general approaches. First of all, there are policies that address housing specifically, and then there are policies that address the broader issue of immigrant integration. So an example of housing policies more specifically, in the United States, for example, historically, arising out of the civil rights movement, we had anti-discrimination legislation, which outlawed sort of discriminatory actions in all housing market transactions. So it's not that discrimination necessarily disappeared right away, but I think overall it did have some effect in reducing black-white segregation. Among other kinds of policies, I know in Europe, and maybe this will be discussed later on, there's housing diversification programs, which they involve replacing old housing stock with new dwellings that vary in size, form, quality, price, and tenure. And so the goal is to attract a diverse group of inhabitants, and the thinking is this will extend to racial and ethnic diversity as well. Now, my reading of the literature of the studies that have looked at the effects of these is, on the whole, these kind of housing policies might have some effect, a little bit on the modest side. Now, just speaking finally to policies that address immigrant integration more generally, I'll start first with admissions policies. There are guest worker or temporary worker policies, for example, and I think while they might have some economic benefits, I think these are not policies that facilitate immigrant integration. Of course, they're not even designed to do that. Workers are expected to stay for a little while and then return to their home countries. But the reality is that many of these immigrants end up staying for a long time, and they don't really facilitate that connection immigrants have with the host country, and we've seen that in the experience of a number of countries. So I think there are other kinds of policies that could help immigrants connect to the local labor markets and facilitate their transition. Language courses, vocational training. There are policies that can encourage citizenship acquisition, such as by funding community-based organizations that help immigrants prepare for naturalization. So any kinds of policies that help strengthen the ties between immigrants and the host country. So just to end, it's just some concluding remarks. Of course, this is an issue of broad concern, and for good reason. We have growing immigration, growing diversity, and there are a lot of commentators who are concerned that what's going to be the end result of this? Is it going to result in new divisions? I think by and large, the news, the empirical evidence suggests that the news is not all that bad necessarily. I think we are seeing some measure of residential incorporation, but again, a lot of variation across cities and across groups that can still be of great concern in a number of localities. I think of the two housing types of approaches. There are housing policies, which, again, my reading is that they can have some effect, tend to be on the modest. I think over the longer run, what's just as important is looking at the issue of immigrant integration more generally. It's integration in the economy, social incorporation, political incorporation, and as long as we see incorporation in those spheres, I think residential incorporation will follow. So I look forward to people's questions later on as well.
Thanks very much, John. And I think that issue of how housing policies fit into a broader integration approach leads us on very nicely to our next speaker, since Corrie has done so much to think about how these pieces fit together in Rotterdam. So Corrie Laus, who's up next, she was until very recently Vice Mayor of Rotterdam, and there she was responsible for labour markets, higher education, innovation and participation. And Corrie is also a long-standing friend of MPI and a regular participant at Transatlantic Council's meetings. She very kindly hosted a follow-up meeting to the cities meeting I mentioned earlier in Rotterdam in April, where we discussed some of the issues around local belonging and urban citizenship. And you can also find the conclusions of that meeting online, as I said earlier. Anyway, so Corrie is joining us from Berlin today. Welcome, Corrie. Thanks very much for joining us, and we really look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry for the bad connection because I'm due to the conference center, so it will be a little bit hampering, I'm afraid, but it's my first webinar, and I'm very pleased to join such excellent professors. So I think I'm a little bit in trouble being just a politician. But just to answer your question on the Rotterdam example, I think you have to bear in mind that 48% of the population in Rotterdam has actually a mixed cultural background, 48%. So it's in the city everywhere, in every way. And if you look at the approaches we've chosen in the past, and I think John mentioned some of them, we've tried them all. And some were more successful than the others. But we face three specific problems at the moment. The superdiversity in the city. It's not so easy to grasp on the problems you face and find solutions quick enough. The second one is the integration has risen above the national level already. Everything that's happening on the international news has its impact also on neighborhoods and on schools in areas in Rotterdam, and that's going fast. And the third problem we face is that especially the areas where the social economic power is weak, where people are unemployed, where the incomes are low, where the housings are bad, that especially in these areas tend to be more and more a transit house. So everybody with a little bit of power gets out of it, which makes it really hard to combat the problems in these areas. And on the other hand, of course, we need all new talents from abroad. If you just look at the competitiveness globally, then you can't afford to shut people out. And secondly, demographically, if you just look at demographic figures in the Netherlands, then we can't afford to use all talents already there. So we have a lot to do, and I think the best approach flexible instruments. For instance, building new houses takes a lot of time, and it's not so flexible at all. The measures we took recently actually were community. If you want to strengthen local communities, then you have to get your own act together. All personnel in all areas, all services, all process of the city staff has to be aligned.
I think we may have
partners because they benefit from the diversity in the city. So for us, it's really, really important to make. Is the connection bad?
Yeah, I mean, we keep losing you every so often, just when it's the most interesting bits. Could you just try speaking again, and then we'll see whether or not it's working better now?
Oh. Yeah. Well, I'll just shorten it then, because otherwise, as I said earlier, we are focusing now on more flexible instruments. because we experience that the current situation needs more flexible instruments, and specifically instruments like new housing is not that flexible actually. So that's why we invest in our own city staff, all processes and all personnel to be cultural sensitive and make sure that we do our own work the best we can to really meet up with the needs of everyone in the city, regardless their background, and dealing with super diversity. Partnerships is key, especially with enterprises. Thirdly, we like to tap into all kinds of networks in the city, from the Facebook page of a school to the migrant church that's actually meeting with a lot of people in their own neighborhood. Tapping up with networks that are changing every day, and be sure that you go along with these networks is, I think, a really important one. The fourth measure is actually we try to seduce citizens a little bit of seduction to do a little bit more. And that counts for all citizens, so not only the ones who need help, but especially the ones who could do more. And the last one, the most important one, it's all about people meeting people. If I just look at the figures of polarization, then it's due to not knowing the people, not having met them, that really causes polarization in the city. So we invest a lot in all kinds of interactive, very, very small, detailed programs, not invented by the city government, but all kinds of meetings that are organized by people themselves, and just enforce them a little bit by a little bit of money. And of course, language is key. So we invest heavily in really talking Dutch in all kinds of ways, but also the other way around. If people follow a language course, it's not for free. They have to invest their time, and they have to sign up for it, that they will actually end the course as well. And if they don't end the course, then they have to pay for it, just to make sure that nothing is granted for nothing. But if you do put an effort in Rotterdam society, then we will actually make sure that you get the best we can offer you. And I think that's an approach, an inclusive approach, that's really helping in dealing with all these problems. But we can't combat them on our own. Perhaps that's the most important message. As a local authority, of course, you do the best you can, and you are an important player, and especially when it comes to being a role model. We can do a lot, and I think it's very promising that we have a Moroccan Dutch mayor in the city of Rotterdam, and we need more role models like him, like Ahmed Abu Talib. But I think the message should be, we need all the help we can get.
Thanks so much, Corrie, and I'm really pleased that even though you cut out a little bit when you were describing the problems, as soon as you just started describing the solutions, I could hear you very well, and hopefully everyone else could as well. So I think we got the important bit, and I'm sorry for the poor connection to anyone who missed any of that very, very insightful presentation. So last but not least, we have Patrick Simon. He's Director of Research at the Institut National d'Études Démographiques and Fellow at the Centre d'Études Européennes at Sciences Po in Paris. Patrick's done a huge amount of work on social and ethnic segregation in French cities, on anti-discrimination policies, and on the integration of first and second generation immigrants, both in France and also in other European countries. He's also worked as an expert for the European Commission, for Eurostat, for the Council of Europe, for the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, and even more high profile than all of that, he's been a regular author and contributor to MPI work. So Patrick, we're turning to you to hopefully discuss the socioeconomic dimension of segregation. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Megan. I'm very happy to join you for this webinar, which is a very challenging type of discussion. Anyway, so I would like to develop 4 points briefly to follow up on the presentation. So one about the segregation in France, and then we'll talk about employment shortly, and asking ourselves if there is a neighborhood effect. What kind of evidence do we really think that segregation itself increases the problems, or maybe it's not part of the problem? It's more a symptom than a driver for the problems. And lastly, I will touch upon shortly about policies. It has been already addressed before. So segregation in France, we do have recent studies showing that there are some bad news. I mean, basically, there is an increasing level of socioeconomic segregation and even ethnic segregation. That's the last point is was not that much studied before because we lack of data. But now with that, we can have more information about ethnic segregation. We can see that there are sizable concentration not only of immigrants but also of second generation population in different deprived neighborhoods. These are some bad news in the sense that even if the second generation is less segregated than the first one, than the immigrants, are still pretty much well above the average concentration in deprived neighborhoods. So whatever indicator that you use, we find significant level of segregation for them. The chance of living in a high unemployment neighborhood or low income neighborhood is 4 times to 5 times more than the mainstream population, controlling for socioeconomic background. When it comes to what we would call visible minorities, which are not only immigrants on second generation, but those coming from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. So there is a crystallization of segregation for them, where the European immigrants on second generation do not face the same problem. So we have a specific racialized level of segregation, and I'm sure that the international opinion have seen that through the riots in 2005, which occur in most of major suburbs in France. So what was the driver of the riots? One of the most important one is the issue of unemployment. And if you look at the data, basically there is a 10% of unemployment on average in France. And if you take the most deprived neighborhoods, those who are under specific political policies, the unemployment is 2.5 times higher, 24–25%. And when it comes to immigrants in these neighborhoods, they may have even higher level of unemployment. Maybe one of the good news is that immigrants are less unemployed. I mean, the gap between immigrants on second and the mainstream population is lower in these neighborhoods than in the other part of the territorial structure in France. So it seems that all inhabitants in these zones face high level of unemployment regardless of their ethnic background. But among those who are living there, they are predominantly with an immigrant background. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why there are specific policies trying to address the problems of unemployment and access to jobs in these neighborhoods. So one of the question is whether or not, because of the concentration, there are a specific local effect on access to employment. And most of the studies find mixed findings somehow. Well, one of the options is what we call spatial mismatch, here that living in these neighborhoods which may be far away from jobs, and it takes time, information to have access to these jobs, and so segregation itself reduces the likelihood that you will find a job with the same kind of skills and competencies. But that was not what the studies found. They found that basically in Europe, I mean, public transportation is not that bad, so it reduces the impact of isolation. Secondly, information may be a reason why low-skilled and immigrant persons do not have access to jobs, and this is maybe one of the issues in these segregated neighborhoods. But still, there is a third level which is very even more important, which is the reputation of the neighborhoods. So here we touch upon discrimination based on the place where you live. And this is one of the problems to try to requalify the reputation of these neighborhoods, because we have some studies audit testing studies that show that with the same kind of profiles, an applicant that is coming from a specific neighborhood, a well-known neighborhood with some social problems, will have less job offers with the same kind of profile than another one which is coming from another neighborhood. So there is a specific impact of the neighborhood itself. And some of the policies try to address that. So here I come to the policies themselves. And, well, there is a urban policy for a long time in France. I mean, it dates back to 1982. So now it's almost more than 30 years that these policies have been implemented. They have changed over time. I mean, at the beginning, they were more looking for community cohesion, social cohesion. They were trying to improve, to empower inhabitants. And then they have moved to more an economic treatment. So they try to have a tax policy to bring in firms that will bring jobs to the neighborhoods. But it has not been successful either. And then there have been a huge, massive urban renewal politics that is demolition, redistribution of population in other neighborhoods, and it's still going on. And the last policies, for a year now, there was a new law that has been enacted, and we don't know exactly what's going on. I mean, it's a policy of equality between territories, and they have enlarged the scope of the policy to touch not only suburbs and the kind of usual suspects as the poor neighborhoods, but to include as well poor neighborhoods based on income, of the average income of the population, which could be located in countryside, in rural areas. So it's not a urban policy anymore. It's more a policy which is addressing neighborhoods themselves. So here we are now, and I would say that this combination of policies basically failed to improve the job prospects or the economic prospects for the inhabitants of these low-income neighborhoods. All the data that we collected show that in the last 10 years, the gap between these neighborhoods and the rest of the society has increased rather than decreased. And even more since 2008 with the economic crisis, the gap has really grow bigger. So there is one problem, which is why can't we really be successful in trying to reduce the specificities of these neighborhoods created not only by concentration but by segregation dynamics. And one of the questions is, should we address more population targeted by their categories, immigrants, second generation, maybe low-income population, regardless where they live, or should we still have a territorial policy, which means we address everyone living in the neighborhood, and maybe sometimes it's less concentrated than in the US, and you may have middle-class families living in these neighborhoods benefiting from the policy redistribution. And this is one of the questions that are on the table now.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm really pleased that we had 3 very complementary and different presentations today. So we've started to get a lot of questions in, but just to remind people that you can email questions to any of the speakers or all of them to communications@migrationpolicy.org, or if you have managed to find your Twitter password, which I could not, you can tweet #MPICities. So first up, we had a question about the role of the media. So how much is this, is there a negative portrayal of segregated areas coming from the media, and is there a different perception among the public than is the reality? Are people misled by the media about the issue of segregation? Perhaps we could go to John on that one.
I was afraid you'd ask me. No.
I could sort of see your face.
No, yeah, no. I think you're right that I think oftentimes the media does sort of play on stereotypes about different areas. I think in the United States, I think if we were to look historically, let's say at African Americans sort of and the neighborhoods they live in. I think people have very negative views of those just from what they see. Let's say stories emphasizing crime and things like that, which I don't think always reflect reality. That's not to say that, let's say, poor neighborhoods or poor and minority neighborhoods are they're not free of problems, but I think I think the images that people get reinforce stereotypes more than really reflect reality.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to take that question, or should we go to a new one?
Well, I mean,
yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, I think it's a critical point because, of course, if you take seriously the point that there could be an issue of reputation. So the image of the neighborhood is increasing the lack of resources that the inhabitants may locally have. So this is important to see how the media are contributing somehow to this creation of the reputation.
Thank you. And we have a question specifically for Corey, if she's still online. I noticed that she went in and out a second ago, so hopefully this will work. And this was.
I'm back online.
Oh, you're back online. Good. That's good news. How do you feel about Rotterdam now that the city and the integration portfolio is in the hands of Livable Rotterdam? Do you feel optimistic about its future? How are you feeling?
Well, I think the solutions will come from the bottom-up approaches. If there's one thing I'm really convinced about, is that the political system at a local level isn't able to solve these kind of problems. As I said earlier, we need all the help we can get, and especially from the inhabitants themselves. And when it comes to the reputation issue, we have this area that has been in the news for several times with all kind of bad news, and every time something is happening over there, then it's considered as a proof that it's still a bad area, even though the facts show that we have improved a lot, actually. But still, as long as the media keep reporting how terrible these areas are, it's really, really difficult, for instance, for enterprises to convince them to recruit people coming from this area. Well, one of the things we've tried actually is to make sure that people apply for jobs without a postcode area code on the form, and it really helped, strangely enough. So sometimes it's just in the little details that you can do something. So I'm optimistic because I see a lot of people that care. If I just look at the figures, how much people feel that they belong to the city, that's increasing every 2 years. We measured every 2 years, and 74% of the people living in Rotterdam feel strongly attached to it. So, and they really want to take an effort in being part of the city and take some action. And that's, I think, a positive sign.
Thank you. And next up we have a fairly, I would say, a philosophical question, so I think it's probably for all three of you. So John talks a little in his report about the difference between the US approach, which is all about giving people the tools to move out of a neighborhood, and the idea that opportunity means being able to move onwards and upwards, whereas the European approach is that you can't leave any neighborhoods behind and you need to focus on improving neighborhoods for all of the residents. Does anyone have a view on which is the best approach? Should we go to John first? Sorry.
Okay, I could give it a start. I think over time, when you think about policies, I think they've in some ways swung back and forth. So at times in the United States, there have been place-based policies. When you think of the 1990s, there were these enterprise zones. I tend to think that the effect of place-based policies has been modest up to now, and I think maybe that's why then the pendulum swings the other way. So I think place-based policies can help, but sometimes it depends on the context. So let's say if you're trying to revitalize neighborhoods in let's say, Detroit, the overall problem is that the economy of Detroit has been going down for decades. So people think, well, to what extent can you make a big difference if the overall, economy is imploding? That's why there's been a little bit of a swing to person-placed approaches, but of course these then do, the people who are left behind are often the worst off. And to think that in all cases you can't do anything to revitalize communities, I think that's wrong as well. So maybe it's the best approach is a mix of both.
And Patrick or Corey, did either of you have a European view on this question?
I think we need all approaches. If you just think about the future that lies ahead with much more super diversity, then you can't afford to leave any approach out, I suppose.
And do you have, I mean, the Rotterdam case is very interesting because you find that people often move out to the suburbs once they've become more affluent. Do you think that the possible way forward is to try and encourage these people back into the centre and to encourage the sort of gentrification of neighbourhoods, and or do you think that this is the way that things are in Rotterdam?
Well, to be quite honest, I think we just have to think a little bit bigger than just the postal area of Rotterdam. If they just move out to a suburb and they do it and lots of them do actually, and it's getting more mixed in the surrounding neighborhoods. That's, I think, only a good sign that we are mixing in all areas in the area of Rijnmond, the area that's surrounding Rotterdam. And of course, if you just look at the interdependencies between cities in the Netherlands, you can easily see that Randstad, the combination of The Hague, Amsterdam, Utrecht, Rotterdam, is already growing into one area, one region. Something we don't like to admit, of course, being the second city, with the second city syndrome, of course, always comparing ourselves with Amsterdam. But if you just look at how people move around, how they pick housing, how they pick their jobs, what their kids do, where they study, what kind of schools they attend to, then you can see that the area is getting bigger and bigger already. And that's the fact of life.
And Patrick, should people be given the tools to move out of neighbourhoods and succeed, flourish elsewhere, or is it more important to improve the neighbourhoods?
Well, I think it's an important fact that people can do whatever they want. So creating more freedom of mobility is an important thing. But when it comes to a policy in itself, one of the problems is first there should be an access in the non-segregated neighborhoods, and it's not always the case. When you see the MTO experiment in the US, it seemed that those who were offered a voucher to go out of poor neighborhoods were not able to access to any kind of neighborhoods as well, because there are some redlining, there are some control filtering process. So it's not always possible to open the gates for mobility. And secondly, I think we have portrayed, John and Corey said very clearly that there are an increased diversity of the population. So the point is, in Europe, most of the big cities are very diverse. So when we talk about segregation of immigrants, what we have in mind is that they could be less visible. But the point is, visibility of ethnic diversity is there to stay. When you take the numbers in France, among almost 10% of the population could be an immigrant, and a bit more, say 12 to 13%, would be second generation. It makes almost a fourth of the population. When you go to Paris and the neighborhood department, I mean the area of Paris, it's almost 50% of the population which is with an immigrant background on 2 generations. When you go to Seine-Saint-Denis, which is the place where the riots began in one of the departments, 1.5 million inhabitants, okay? It's 75% of the population without an immigrant background. Where do they gonna go? If you want to desegregate them, when you're gonna put these people? They're gonna live somewhere else, and they're gonna increase the level of immigration or immigrant background people in other neighborhoods. So it's exactly the same process. So I don't think that desegregation per se It's an objective. What is an objective is to create resources for the population where they could not be in an equal position, and that's John put it clearly as well. I mean, it's not the concentration per se the problem. The problem is inequalities, unequal access to jobs, education, housing. So bring resources wherever people live is important.
Thank you. And then we had a question about the events in Ferguson and possible parallels with some of the riots that Europe has faced in recent years. I know, John, you mentioned this, and Patrick as well. Do you see any similar causal factors in the riots that Ferguson has recently experienced compared to Paris in 2005 or London in 2011 or Stockholm, I guess, more recently? Perhaps we could go to John again. Sorry that I keep choosing you first.
No, absolutely. And I think, again, I mentioned Ferguson is in St. Louis, which is one of the most, in the top 10 most segregated cities in the country. Not at the very top, but in the top 10. So again, here the issue is not segregation itself. It's not just segregation itself. It's the overlapping inequalities. So I think a big part of the story there was the underrepresentation of African Americans in the local government, which was still overwhelmingly white. So I think it's segregation both causes and is reinforced by these overlapping inequalities. So when people sort of feel behind, feel disadvantaged along a number of dimensions, I think that's the recipe for riots and discontent, alienation.
And Patrick or Corey? Patrick?
Yeah, it's striking how riots have followed almost the same pattern. It begins with the police abuse, murder, or whatever you call it, and it was the case in France. And every riot in France began with a problem with the police. So I think there is one very specific, and that was the case for UK as well. So I think there is two dimensions. One is the background of inequalities that create the conditions for uprising somehow. But the second one is there needs a starter, and the starter is the relationship between the youth population of these neighborhoods and the police forces. And there is a big problem. It seems, I thought that the US was doing better, but it's not the case. At least for France, it's a really bad situation. We don't know how to cope with the kind of police harassment. Somehow there are problems of dialogues, how to enforce security without being like a control of the population every time in specific neighborhoods. And this is a major issue, and it seems that it's urgent to try to do something. It makes sure that it's not done. It will be next year in November, the 10 years of the riots of 2005. And I will not say that anything has changed on this respect for the relationship between police forces and the youth population.
And Corey, obviously Rotterdam hasn't had the same riots, and you also mentioned that it's been a really big objective to make sure that all of the city institutions reflect the population they serve, and you've been trying to encourage diversity across all levels of local government and all of the city services. Has Rotterdam been successful in recruiting minorities, Moroccan minorities, to the police force? Do you feel like it succeeded in this objective?
Actually, that's the first department we started. So I think they've done a good job in making sure that they're more representative of the city. But it's not the whole story. It's not only about having representative people in the force, in the police force themselves. It's all about being inclusive at every level. Every policeman should know how to handle diversity in the streets. So I think the broad programs that people were taught to be more intercultural sensitive are much more important actually than having also representatives from different groups within the police force itself. I think the second thing we face in the Netherlands, yes, we had some demonstrations as well. As what I said earlier, everything that happens in the international policies, politics, for instance, what's happening now in the Middle East, it reflects the next day in neighborhoods. So we had some demonstrations in The Hague recently. No riots yet, luckily, and hopefully they won't happen. But if you just look at the how politicians reacted upon these demonstrations, you can see that we didn't figure out actually how to partner up with what they are really saying, and I really see the same pattern as Patrick explains. It's not that harsh in the Netherlands. It's a soft version of it, but still it starts with a group of youth, a group of youngsters who feel not seen as fully fledged citizens with all their backgrounds available, and that's something we should really should take care of.
So I think we probably have time for one more question. So we have another fairly broad philosophical question, and this is: do you think we can have ethnic enclaves and social cohesion at the same time? Who'd like to go first? Perhaps Patrick?
Yeah, to change a bit. I do think we can have both at the same time. I think it depends on the kind of social organization of the cities, of the nation state itself. So there is not a necessary contradiction between cohesion and ethnic enclave, but it could be absolutely a ghetto, or it could be one of piece of a general system of coordination between neighborhoods and ethnic groups in a society. So it's hard to have a definite answer to that. I mean, you could have different system, spatial, economic, and political system that could be against the idea that having an ethnic enclave, or reversely, you could have a very nice organization of this type of enclaves. So I think it's hard to, maybe it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I would not say that there is necessarily a contradiction, but I would say we don't have up to now kind of political organization that makes sure that ethnic enclave connect to each other and really participate to cohesion.
Thank you. And John?
I'd say I agree with Patrick. I think ethnic enclaves, as long as, again, the issue partly is there other kinds of inequality that accompany the enclave, and to the extent that there are other differences, I think that isn't a recipe for stability. But if ethnic enclaves are relatively well off, if residents feel that they have avenues for upward mobility, I think there are multicultural countries with groups living in different areas which are fairly stable. I do at the same time I do think that that you have to sort of keep an eye on to what extent you have this equal opportunities remain. So I think it has a potential for cleavages and disharmony down the road, but I don't think necessarily that you can't have ethnic enclaves with a lot of alienation and big social divisions.
And Corey, would you like to have the last word on this?
Well, just to give you an example, we tend to look into enclaves when they cause problems, and I think we should look much earlier into ethnic enclaves. Take, for instance, the Pakistani community in Rotterdam, which is only a couple of thousands of them, but they have all the features of being an ethnic enclave, with also some inequalities in it, and we didn't notice actually until we looked into depth what was happening within the Pakistani community, because they didn't cause any problems. So why bother? So I really had a hard time to defend that we could segregated groups to other groups, and they have the same opportunities as other groups as well. So I totally agree with the both speakers, but just wanted to give us a specific example because it is happening in cities, and we should really, really look closely to it.
No, thank you very much, and that was a great question to finish on, I think. That just gives me enough time to do my little logistics plug for our work roundup. Thank you so much, John, Corey, and Patrick. That was a really wonderful discussion. It was extremely interesting and nice to hear sort of different ways of addressing the same questions. For your viewers, thank you so much for the time and your interest and such excellent questions. I've been instructed to tell you that a video of this chat will be available within minutes, which seems like an amazing technological feat, on our website, which is www.migrationpolicy.org. And just another reminder, if you haven't had enough, that you can find all of the reports from this series at migrationpolicy.org/transatlantic. Thanks again, everyone, for your time, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.